Volume 2, Chapter 1 of The Day Will Come by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. All the creatures made for heaven's honors have their ends, and good ones, all but the cozening crocodiles, false women. February had begun, the frost and snow had disappeared. There were soft breathings of spring in the breezes that blew over the broad grassy downs beyond the Roman encampment, and the sportsmen of the neighborhood were rejoicing in open weather and lengthening daylight, but Juliet Baldwin was still at Medlow Court, and the heart of Harrington Dalbrook was heavy as he set out in the pleasant morning for some distant meet; and it was heavier as he rode home in the evening, after a day's sport which had shown him only too distinctly that the black horse was not so young as he had been. He hugged himself with the delusion that those indications of advancing years, which were but too obvious towards the close of a trying day across a heavy country, would vanish after a week's rest, and that the horse would show no signs of staleness at Tattersall's, where he must inevitably be sold before the end of the month, his owner seeing no other way of meeting the bill that had been given in exchange for a beast whose name should have been not Mahmud, but White Elephant. Harrington's sole motive for buying a hunter, or rather, his sole excuse for being trapped into the purchase, was the expectation of being able to ride to hounds in Miss Baldwin's company. She had said to him, "You ought to hunt," and he had straightway hunted, just as, if she had told him to balloon, he would have ballooned. And now Juliet Baldwin was following the hounds in another county while he was in Dorsetshire plodding along dreary roads to inaccessible meets at places which would seem to have been chosen with a special study of everybody's inconvenience. The whole business was fraught with bitterness. He had never loved hunting for its own sake, had never possessed the single-mindedness of the genuine sportsman, who cares not for weather or country, or companionship, or hunger or thirst, so long as there is a fox at the beginning of the day and blood at the end. Juliet was out with the hounds 3 days a week. She wrote rapturous accounts of 40 minutes here and an hour there, and every run which she described was apparently the quickest thing that had ever been known in that country. She let her lover know en passant that she had been greatly admired, and that her horsemanship had been talked about. Her letters were very affectionate, but they testified also to a self-love that amounted to adoration. Her frocks, her horses, provided as the young ravens are fed by a kindly Providence in the shape of casual acquaintance, her breaks at billiards, her waltzing, were all dilated upon with a charming frankness. "It seems rather foolish to write all this egotistical twaddle," she apologized. "But you complain if I send you a short letter, and there is literally nothing to tell here, at least nothing about any one you know, or that would have the faintest interest for you, so I am obliged to scribble about my frocks and my little social triumphs." This was kindly meant, no doubt, but it stung him to be reminded that his friends were not her friends, that Belgravia is not further from Islington than her people were from his people. In one of her letters she wrote casually, "Why don't you put Mahmud into a horse box and come over for a day with these hounds? It would be capital fun. There is a dear little rustic inn where you and your horse could put up, and Lady B. would ask you to dinner as a matter of course. I dare say your highly respectable hair will stand on end at some of our ways, but that won't matter. I am sure you would enjoy an evening or two at Medlow. Think about it, like a dear boy." Harrington did think about it. Indeed, from the first reading of his lady love's unceremonious invitation he thought of nothing else. After much puzzling over timetables he found that trains, those particular trains which condescend, with an asterisk, to carry horses, could be matched so as to convey the black horse to the immediate vicinity of Medlow Court in something under a day, and this being so he telegraphed his intention of putting up at the Medlow Arms on the following night, taking pains to add "shall arrive at 5 p.m. so as to secure the promised invitation to dinner." He had been so chary of spending money since his loan to Juliet that he had still a few pounds in hand, enough as he thought to pay travelling expenses and hotel bills. His heart was almost light as he packed his hunting gear and dress suit, albeit March 10 was written in fiery characters across a spectral bill which haunted him wherever he went. It was still early in February, he told himself. Some stroke of luck might happen to him. Some rich young fool at Medlow Court might take a fancy to Mahmud and want to buy him. He had heard of men who wanted to buy horses, although it had been his fate to meet only the men who were eager to sell. After no less than 3 changes of trains he arrived at the Toppleton Road Station, for Medlow and Toppleton, about 4:30, weary but full of hope. He was to see her again, after 3 weeks' severance. He was going at her own express desire. It was her tact and cleverness that had made the visit easy for him. Had he not Lady Burdenshaw's invitation in his pocket, in a fine open hearted hand, sprawling over 3 sides of large note paper? "Dear Mr. Dalbrook, I hear you are coming over for a day or 2 with our hounds, and I hope you will contrive to dine with us every evening while you are in the neighbourhood. Your father and Sir Phillimore were old friends. Dinner at 8. Sincerely yours, Sarah Burdenshaw." Sir Phillimore had been in the family vault nearly 15 years. The malicious averred that he had sought that dismal shelter as a refuge and a relief from the life which Lady Burdenshaw imposed upon him, open house, big shoots, hunting breakfasts, fancy balls, and private theatricals in the country, and in London perpetual parties or perpetual gadding about. Sir Phillimore's grandfather had come up from Aberdeen, a raw boy without a penny, and had found out something about the manufacture of iron which had eventually made him a millionaire. Sir Phillimore's fortune had reconciled the beautiful Sally Tempest to a marriage with a man who was her senior by a quarter of a century, and the only license she had allowed herself had been her indulgence in boundless extravagance, and a laxity of manner which had somewhat shocked society in the sober 50s and 60s, though it left her moral character unimpeached. In the 80s nobody wondered or exclaimed at Lady Burdenshaw's freedom of speech and manner, or at the manners she encouraged in her guests. In the 80s Sarah Burdenshaw was generally described as "good fun." Harrington found the dear little rustic inn very picturesque externally, but small and stuffy within, and the bedroom into which he was ushered was chiefly occupied by a large, old-fashioned 4-post bedstead, with chintz hangings that smelt of mildewed lavender. Indeed, the pervading odour of the Medlow Arms was mildew. He dressed as well as he could under considerable disadvantages, and a rumbling old landau, which had the local odour, conveyed him to Medlow Court much quicker than he could have supposed possible from his casual survey of the horse. It was 10 minutes to 8 when he entered Lady Burdenshaw's drawing room. It was a very large room, prettily furnished in a careless style, as if by a person whose heart was not set upon furniture. There were plenty of low luxurious chairs, covered with a rather gaudy chintz, and befrilled with lace and muslin, and there were flowers in abundance, but of human life the room was empty. Harrington hardly knew whether he was relieved or discomposed at finding himself alone. He had leisure in which to pace the room 2 or 3 times, to arrange his tie and inspect his dress suit before one of the long glasses, and then to feel offended at Juliet's coldness. She knew that he was to be there. She might surely have contrived to be in the drawing room 10 minutes before the dinner hour. Half a dozen people straggled in, a not too tidy looking matron in ruby velvet, a sharp featured girl in black lace, and some men who looked sporting or military. One of these talked to him. "I think you must be Mr. Dalbrook," he said, after they had discussed the weather and the state of the roads. "You are quite right, but how did you guess?" "Miss Baldwin told me you were coming, and I don't think there's any one else expected to-night. Do you know your hostess?" "I am waiting for that privilege." "Ah, that explains your punctuality. Nobody is ever punctual at Medlow. 8 o'clock means half past, and sometimes a quarter to 9. Lady Burdenshaw has reached her 60th year without having arrived at a comprehension of the nature of time, as an inelastic thing which will not stretch to suit feminine convenience. She still believes in the elasticity of an hour, and rushes off to her room to dress when she ought to be sitting down to dinner. Her girl friends follow her example, and seldom leave the billiard room or the tea room till dear Lady B leads the way." A whole bevy of ladies entered the room rather noisily at this moment, and among them appeared Juliet, magnificent in a red gown, which set off the milky whiteness of her shoulders. "Rather a daring combination with red hair," remarked the young lady in black, who was sitting on a narrow causeuse with a large man, whose white moustache and padded chest suggested a cavalry regiment. "You may call the lady a harmony in red," said the gentleman. Harrington scowled upon these prattlers, and then crossed the room to greet his love. Yes, it was a daring combination, the scarlet gown with the ruddy tints in her auburn hair, but the audacity was justified by success. She looked a magnificent creature, dazzling as Vashti in her Eastern splendor, invincible as Delilah. Who could resist her? She gave her hand to Harrington, and seemed pleased to see him, but in the next moment he saw her looking beyond him towards the end of the room. He turned, involuntarily following the direction of her eyes, and saw the man who had talked to him, and who was now evidently watching them. He was a middle-aged man, handsome, tall, and upstanding, and with an air which Harrington considered decidedly patrician. "Who is that man by the piano?" he asked. "Major Swanwick, Lord Beaulieu's younger brother." "Ah, I thought he was a swell," said Harrington innocently. "He was very civil to me just now. You might have been in the drawing room a little earlier, Juliet. You must have known that I was longing to see you." "My dear boy, we were playing skittle pool till 5 minutes to 8. I had no idea you were in the house. Ah, here comes Lady B." A fat, fair, flaxen-haired lady in a sky blue tea gown embroidered with silver palm leaves came rolling into the room, murmuring apologies for having kept people waiting for their dinner. "I know you must all be delightfully ravenous," she said, "and that's ever so much better than feeling that dinner has come too soon after lunch." Juliet introduced her friend, who was most graciously received. "How is your father?" asked Lady Burdenshaw. "It is ages since I saw him — more than 20 years, I believe. Sir Phillimore bought some land in your country, and Mr. Dalbrook acted for him in the matter, and he still receives the rents. And so you are going out with the hounds to morrow? They meet quite near — not more than 7 or 8 miles from your inn. Juliet will show you the way across country. She's always in the first flight — but if you want to know her particular talent you should see her play pool. I can assure you she makes all the men sit up." Harrington scarcely followed the lady's meaning. There was no time for explanations, as the butler, who had been waiting for her ladyship's appearance, now announced dinner, and Harrington had the bliss of going to the dining room with Juliet Baldwin on his arm. He felt as if he were in the Moslem's enchanted fields as he sat by her side at the brilliant table, with its almost overpowering perfume of hothouse flowers, which were grouped in great masses of bloom among the old silver and the many-coloured Venetian glass. Yes, it was a Mohammedan paradise, and this was the Houri, this lovely creature with the milky shoulders rising out of soft folds of scarlet crape. "How long are you going to stay here, Juliet?" he asked, as the Houri unfolded her napkin. She gave a little laugh before she answered the question. "Compare this room and table with our dining room at the Mount — you can compare the dinner with my mother's dinners after you have eaten it, and ask yourself if any reasonable creature would be in a hurry to leave this Canaan for that wilderness. I'm afraid I shall stop as long as ever dear old Lady B asks me, and she is always pressing me to extend my visit." "I don't think dinner can be much of attraction in your mind, Juliet," said Harrington. "Of course not. Girls don't care what they eat," replied Juliet, sipping her clear soup and most fully appreciating the flavour. "But there are so many advantages at Medlow. There is the hunting, for instance, which is much better than any I can get at home, where I have positively no horse that I can call my own. Here I can always rely upon a good mount." "Has Lady Burdenshaw a large stable?" "Oh, she keeps a good many horses, but most of hers are only fit for leather. There are men who come here with strings of hunters, and have always a young one that they like me to handle for them." "Juliet, you will get your neck broken," cried Harrington, pale with horror, and staring vacantly at the fish that was being offered to him. "There is no fear of that while I ride young horses. The danger is an old one. My father taught me to ride, and as he was one of the best cross-country riders in Dorset, I am not likely to make a mistake. You had better try that sole Normande. It is one of the Medlow specialties." "Juliet, I hate the idea of your staying in this house — or in any house where there is a crowd of fast men. I hate the idea of your riding men's horses — of your being under an obligation to a stranger." "Don't I tell you that the obligation is all the other way? A young hunter is a more saleable article when he has carried a lady. Will suit a bold horsewoman in a stiff country. That sort of thing is worth a great deal in a catalogue, and the men whose horses I ride are not strangers. At the most they are casual acquaintances." "Call them that if you like. Why should not one profit by one's acquaintances?" "There is one of your benefactors looking at you at this moment, and looking as if he objected to my talking to you." "How dare you talk about my benefactors? Do you suppose I had you invited to Medlow in order that you might insult me?" This little dialogue was conducted in subdued tones, but with a good deal of acrimony upon either side. Harrington was bursting with jealousy. The house, the men, the very atmosphere awakened distrust. He detested those men for their square shoulders and soldierly bearing, for the suggestion of cavalry or household brigade which seemed to him to pervade the masculine portion of the assembly. He had always hated military men. Their chief mission in life seemed to be to make civilians look insignificant. Miss Baldwin ate the next entree in stony silence, and it was not till he had abjectly apologized for his offensive speech that her lover was again taken into favour. She relented at last, however, and favoured him with a good deal of information about the house party which made such a brilliant show at Lady Burdenshaw's luxurious board. The men were for the most part military, the greater number bachelors, or at any rate unencumbered with wives. 2 had been divorced, 1 was a widower, another was separated in the friendliest way from a wife who found she could live in better style unfettered by matrimonial supervision. Major Swanwick was one of the 2 who had profited by Sir James Hannon's jurisdiction. "His wife was Lady Flora Thurles, one of the Tantallans. All the Tantallon girls went wrong, don't you know. It was in the blood." "You and he seem to be great friends," said Harrington, still suspicious. "Oh, we have met very often. He is quite an old chum of mine. He is a good old thing." Seeing that the good old thing looked as if he were well under 40, Harrington was not altogether reassured even by this comfortable tone. He watched his betrothed and the Major all through the long evening in the billiard room, where pool again was the chief amusement of a very noisy party, of which Juliet and Major Swanwick seemed to him the ringleaders and master spirits. It was with difficulty that he, the affianced, got speech with his betrothed. There were just a few minutes while the old family tankards were being carried round with mulled claret and other cunning drinks, in which Juliet vouchsafed to give her attention to her lover, he having in a manner cornered her into a draped recess at the end of the room, where he held her prisoner while he bade her good night. "I shall see you at the meet to morrow," he said. "I won't promise to be at the meet, but I shall find you and the hounds in plenty of time. I know every inch of this country." "Whose horse are you going to ride to morrow?" "A fine upstanding chestnut. I'm sure you'll admire him." "Yes, yes, but whose?" "Whose?" echoed Juliet, as if she scarcely understood the word. "Oh," with a sudden flash of intelligence, "you mean whose property is he? As if that mattered. He belongs to Major Swanwick." "Good night," said Harrington, and he went off to take leave of Lady Burdenshaws, who was sitting in the capacious ingle-nook, with a circle of men about her telling her anecdotes in Parisian French, and from whom every now and then there burst peals of jovial laughter. "At my age one understands everything, and one may hear everything," said her ladyship. Harrington went back to the Medlow Arms more depressed than he had felt during any period of his courtship. Instinct had warned him of the dangers that must lurk in such a house as Medlow Court for such a girl as Juliet Baldwin, but neither instinct nor imagination had prepared him for the horrible reality. To see the woman who was to be his wife smoking cigarettes, playing shilling pool, and bandying doubtful jokes with men who had obviously the very poorest opinion of the opposite sex, was an agony which he had never thought to suffer, and for the first time since his engagement he began to ask himself whether it would not have been better to have trusted his future happiness to the most insipid and colourless of the girls with whom he played tennis than to this magnificent specimen of emancipated smartness. The image of Juliet sprawling over the billiard table, with her eyes on fire and her shoulders half out of her gown as she took a difficult life, pursued him like a bacchanalian nightmare all through his troubled snatches of sleep. The stony straw mattress and lumpy bed would not have been conducive to slumber under the happiest circumstances, but for a mind disturbed by care they were a bed of torture. He rose at 7, unrefreshed, heavy-hearted, detesting Chanticleer, cloudy skies, and all the old-fashioned fuss about a hunting morning, and wishing himself in his comfortable room in the good old house in Cornhill, where he had ample space and all things needful to a luxurious toilette. He got himself dressed somehow. He was in the saddle at 9 o'clock, after a breakfast for which he had no appetite. It was a long, dreary ride to the little roadside inn at which the hounds met, and Harrington, being particularly punctual, had to jog along companionless till the last mile, when Major Swanwick and another man from Medlow overtook him and regaled him with their talk for the rest of the way. "I think I know that black horse," said the Major, who looked provokingly well in his red coat, chimney pot, and cream-coloured tops, thereby making Harrington ashamed of his neat dark grey coat, Bedford cords, and bowler hat. "Wasn't he in Baldwin's stud 9 years ago? I bought him of Sir Henry Baldwin. Thought so. Good hand at selling a horse, Baldwin. However, I suppose there's some work in the black horse yet." "I hope so, for I mean to hunt him to the end of the season," answered Harrington, ignoring that awful necessity of selling before the end of the month. Hope glowed faintly in his breast as he saw the Major's keen eye going over his mount, as if studying the condition of every limb and every muscle. "Wears well," he said, after this deliberate survey. "But I'm afraid you'll find him like a wonderful one horse shay. He'll go to pieces all at once. Did Baldwin tell you his age?" "He said something about rising 8, but I didn't inquire very particularly, as I know the horse is a good one." "And it was a good one of Baldwin to talk about rising 8. He would have been within the mark if he had said rising 18. I bought a horse of Sir Henry myself, and," after a brief pause, "I've sold him one." "And I daresay that made you even," said Harrington with acidity. He would have liked to call the Major out for his insolence, and almost regretted that he was a Briton and not a Frenchman and a professed duellist. "Faith, I don't think he had altogether the best of me, for when he rode that hunter of mine he was like the little old woman in the nursery rhyme, of whom it was said that she should have music wherever she went. He had music, and to spare." And so with jovial laughter they rode up to the open space in front of the Red Cow, where the hounds were grouped about a duck pond, while the master chatted with his friends. It was an hour later before Juliet appeared, cropping up suddenly on a windy common, with 3 other girls and 2 men, while the hounds were drawing the furze. "You see, I could make a pretty good guess where to find you," she said to Harrington. "How well the black looks. You have been saving him up, I suppose?" "No, I've hunted as often as I could. I had no other distraction during your absence." "How sweet of you to say that, with all the gaieties of Dorchester to allure you. Hark! They've found, and we shall be off in a minute. Yes, there he goes," pointing with her whip to the spot where the fox had flashed across the short level sward, vanishing next moment in the withered heather. "Now you'll see what this horse can do, and you can tell me what you think of him when we meet at dinner." There was the usual minute or so of flutter and expectation, and then the businesslike calm, an almost awful calm, every man settling down to his work, intent upon himself, steering carefully for a good place. Harrington was a nervous rider, and if fortune helped him to get a good place he rarely kept it. To day he was more than usually nervous, fancying that Juliet's eye was upon him, which it wasn't, and indeed could not have been unless it had been situated in the back of her head, since she was already ever so far in front. In time, however, he too contrived to settle down, and the black horse took the business into his own hands, and kept his rider fairly close to the hounds. For the first 20 minutes there was a good deal of jumping, but of a mildish order, and Harrington felt that he was distinguishing himself, inasmuch as he was able to stick to his horse, though not always to his saddle. They lost their first fox after a very fair run, and they waited about for nearly 2 hours before they started a second, which they did eventually in a scrubby copse on the skirts of a great stretch of ploughed land. The plough took a good deal out of Mahmud, and after the plough came a series of small fields, with some stiffish fences, which had to be taken by any man who wanted to keep with the hounds. Here Juliet was in her glory, for the chestnut on which she was mounted was a fine fencer, and she knew how to handle him, or perhaps it may be said how to let him alone. Mahmud had been almost as fine a fencer as the fiery young chestnut, and he was a horse of a great heart, always ready to attempt more than he could do. The livery stable people had told Harrington that if his legs were only as good as his heart he would be one of the best hunters in the country. And now, with some quavering of spirit on his own part, Harrington trusted that heart would stand instead of legs, and get him and the black over the fences somehow. Just at this crucial point in the run Juliet was in front of him, and Major Swanwick was pressing him behind. He was near the hounds, and altogether in a place of honour, could he but keep it, and to keep it he felt was worth a struggle. He got over or through the first fence somehow, not gloriously, but without too much loss of time, and galloped gaily towards the second, which looked a stiffer and more complicated affair. Juliet's horse went over like a bird, and Juliet sat him like a butterfly, no more discomposed by the shock than if she had been some winged insect that had lighted on his haunches. Mahmud followed close, excited by the horse in front of him, and rose to his work gallantly. But this time it was timber and not quickset that had to be cleared, and that stiff rail was just too much for the old hunter's legs. He blundered, hit himself with the sharp edge of the rail, and fell heavily forward, sending his rider flying into the next field, and sinking in a struggling mass into the ditch. Major Swanwick dismounted in an instant, scrambled over the hedge, and ran to help Harrington up. " Are you hurt? "" Not much," answered the fallen man, staggering to his feet, hatless, and with a dazed look. " I'm afraid my horse is done for, though, poor old chap." In that moment his only thought was of the beast he had been fond of, which had been to him as a friend, albeit often an unmanageable one. He had no thought just then of the money value of that doubled up mass lying in the ditch. Mahmud had finished his course. His forearm was broken, and the most merciful thing was to make a swift end of him with a bullet from a gun which one of the whips fetched from the nearest farmhouse. His owner stood by him and waited for the end, while Juliet and the rest of the hunt galloped away out of sight. When the shot had been fired the black horse was left to be carted off to the kennels, and Harrington turned to walk slowly and sorrowfully to the farmhouse, where he was promised a trap to convey him to the Medlow Arms. Then and then only did he discover that he had dislocated his shoulder, and was suffering acute agony, and then only did he remember the acceptance which he had given for the black horse. Where now were the £50 which he had reckoned upon getting for the animal at Tattersall's, trusting to Providence or old Hayfield to make up the balance of 30? He saw himself now with that horrible acceptance falling due, and no assets. He got back to the rustic inn with great suffering, and laid himself down upon the stony-hearted four-poster instead of dressing to go and dine at Medlow. The village surgeon came and attended to his shoulder, a painful business, though not unskilfully done; and then he was told he must keep himself as quiet as possible for a few days, and must not think of travelling till the inflammation was reduced. It was his right shoulder on which he had fallen, and he was utterly helpless. The handy young man of the Medlow Arms had to valet him and assist him to eat the tough mutton chop which was served to him in lieu of all the delicacies of Medlow Court. A messenger came from that hospitable mansion at 10 o'clock with a little note from Juliet. "Why did you not turn up at dinner time? Major Swanwick said you were all right. I waited till I saw you get up, safe and sound. So sorry for poor old Mahmud. Come to breakfast to-morrow and tell us all about it. We killed in a quarter of an hour. Yours, Juliet." Harrington sent his best regards to Miss Baldwin and his apologies to Lady Burdenshaw, and begged to inform them that he had dislocated his shoulder and was unable to write. He had a miserable night, sleepless and in pain, haunted by the ghost of Mahmud, whose miserable end afflicted him sorely, and troubled by the perplexities of his financial position. Should he tell his father the whole truth? Alas, it seemed only yesterday that he had told his father the whole truth about his college debts, and though truthfulness is a great virtue, a second burst of candour coming in on the heels of the first might be too much for Mr. Dalbrook's patience. Should he borrow the money from Juanita? No, too humiliating. He had always felt a restraining pride in all his intercourse with his grand relations at Cheriton Chase. They were of his own blood, but they were above him in social status, and he was sensitively alive to the difference in position. Could he apply to his brother? Again the answer was in the negative. He doubted whether Theodore possessed 80 guineas in the world. And so he went on revolving the same considerations through his fevered brain all through the long winter night. There were moments of exasperation and semi-delirium, when he thought he would go over to Medlow Court as soon as he was able to move, and appeal to the beneficence of Lady Burdenshaw for the temporary accommodation of a cheque for 80 guineas. And thus the night wore on till the morning sounds of the inn brought the sense of stern reality across his feverish dreams; and then, amidst the crowing of cocks, and the bumping of pails, and tramping of horses in the stable yard, he contrived to fall asleep, after having failed in that endeavour all through the quiet of the night. It was about 11:30, and the handy man had helped him to make a decent toilette and to establish himself upon a sofa that was a little harder than the bed, when a pony carriage drove up to the door, and the chambermaid came in with an awe-stricken face to announce Lady Burdenshaw and another lady, and would he please to see them, as they wanted to come upstairs. The room was tidy, and he was dressed as well as a helpless man could be, so he said yes, they might come up, which was almost unnecessary, as they were already on the stairs, and were in the room a minute afterwards. Juliet expressed herself deeply concerned at her lover's misfortune, though she did not attempt to conceal from him that she considered his riding in fault. Lady Burdenshaw was more sympathetic, and was horrified at the discomfort of his surroundings. "You cannot possibly endure that cruel looking sofa till your shoulder is well," she said. "And such a small room too, poor fellow, and a horrid low ceiling, and the house smells damp. I wonder if we could venture to move him to the Court, Ju?" Ju was of opinion that such a proceeding would be to the last degree dangerous. "The only chance for his shoulder is to keep quiet," she said. Unfortunately, the surgeon had said the same thing, and there could be no doubt about it. "Perhaps you could send him a sofa?" suggested Juliet. "Of course I could, and I can send him soups and jellies and things, but that isn't like having him at Medlow, where he could have a large airy room, and where you and I could take it in turns to amuse him." "Dear Lady Burdenshaw, you are too good to an almost stranger," murmured Harrington, moved to the verge of tears by her geniality. "Stranger, fiddlesticks! Don't I know your cousin, Lord Cheriton? And has not your father done business for me? Besides, I like young men when they're modest and pleasant as you are. Indeed, I sometimes like them when they're impertinent. I like young faces and young voices about me. I like to be amused, and to see people happy. I can't endure the idea of your lying for ever so many days and nights in this dog kennel, when you came to Medlow to enjoy yourself." "It mustn't be many days and nights. I must get home somehow by the end of the week, if I post all the way." "Oh, you needn't post. When you are able to be moved, my carriage shall take you to the station, and I'll get the railroad people to take an invalid carriage through to Dorchester for you." "Indeed, you must not be impatient, Harry," said Juliet. "I shall come to see you every day, except on the hunting days, and even then I can walk over in the evening, if Lady B. will let me." "Of course I shall let you. All my sympathies are with lovers, and when you are married I shall give Mr. Dalbrook as much of my business as I possibly can venture to take away from those dear old fossils at Salisbury, who have been the family lawyers for the best part of a century." Juliet had confided her engagement to Lady B. at the beginning of her visit, and she and Lady B. had talked over the young man's chances of doing well in the world, and the wisdom or the foolishness of such an alliance. Lady B. had seen a good deal of smart young men and women, and she had discovered that the smart young men were very keen in the furtherance of their own interests, and that the smart young women had considerable difficulty in getting themselves permanently established in the smart world by smart marriages. Some were beautiful and many were admired, but they had to wait for eligible suitors, and one false step in the early stages of their career would sometimes blight their chances of success. Juliet had taken many false steps, and had got herself a good deal talked about, and Lady Burdenshaw felt that her chance of making an advantageous match had been lessening year by year, until it had come to be almost nil. "If this young fellow is sensible and good looking, and has a little money, I really think, Ju, you ought to marry him," concluded Lady B., talking the matter over with her protege before she had seen Harrington. She fancied that Juliet had cooled somewhat in her feelings towards her youthful lover within the last week or 10 days. It might be, Lady B. thought, that she began to perceive that he was too young, that the difference in their ages, which was not much, and the difference in their worldly experience, which was enormous, unfitted them to be happy together. "No doubt the young man is a pis aller," reflected Lady Burdenshaw, after Harrington's appearance at Medlow, "but he is a very good looking fellow, and by no means bad as a pis aller. Of course he is too young for Juliet, and much too fresh and innocent to understand her, but if he knew more he wouldn't be so eager to marry her, so she ought to be satisfied." Lady Burdenshaw sent a delightful sofa and a lot of books, flowers, pillows, foot rests, and other luxuries in one of her own wagons, within an hour of her return to Medlow, and Harrington's comfort was considerably increased by her kindness. Still the thought of that wretched acceptance was like a thorn in every cushion, a scorpion under every pillow, a wasp in every flower. Nor was he altogether at ease about Juliet. He thought that he had detected a constraint in her manner, a shiftiness in her eyes. It had wounded him that she had so promptly opposed his being conveyed to Medlow. It might be that she was influenced only by concern for his safety, yet it would have been natural for his betrothed to wish to have him under the same roof with her, where she might tend and comfort him in his helplessness. Pain and anguish were wringing his brow, and she who should have been his ministering angel was content to limit her ministration to half an hour of somewhat disjointed conversation, and to the polite attention of bringing him the morning papers, when everybody at Medlow had looked at them. Lady Burdenshaw had very kindly taken upon herself to write to Matthew Dalbrook, explaining his son's prolonged absence, and making light of his accident as a matter only involving a few days' rest. The few days had gone on till the 4th day after his fall, and in spite of all that Lady Burdenshaw had done to ameliorate his captivity, the hours of the day and night seemed to grow longer and longer, till he began to think of Silvio Pellico and the man in the iron mask. Juliet's visits were very short, and she was obviously absent-minded and bored even during that scanty half hour which she gave to her betrothed. "I'm afraid you are like Colonel Enderby's wife," he said, "and that the sight of sickness or suffering is more than you can bear." "Who was Colonel Enderby's wife?" "Don't you know? She is the heroine of a very clever novel, an original, strange, and I fear not unnatural character." "Don't remember her," answered Juliet carelessly. "I don't read many English novels. They are too slow for me." On the hunting day he missed even that brief visit, and was expectant of her coming all the evening, as she had promised to make up for the day's absence. But the night was wet, and she told him next day that she did not like to take out Lady Burdenshaw's horse and man in such weather. "The stable people would have resented it, and I am obliged to stand well with the stable," she said. He thought she had a troubled look that day. It seemed to him that it cost her an effort to keep her attention upon any subject, and she lapsed into silence every now and then, looking dreamily out of the window to the thatched roofs and ploughed fields in the distance. "I'm afraid you have something on your mind," he said. "What nonsense! What put such an idea into your head?" "You are so thoughtful, and so much more silent than usual." "There is so little to talk about in a sick room. If I were to tell you about our doings at Medlow I should only bore you." "Not at all. I should be very pleased to hear how you amuse yourself. Is Major Swanwick still there?" "Yes, he is still there." He saw that her cheeks crimsoned as she answered his question, and he wondered whether she really had any penchant for the Major, or whether she suspected his jealous apprehensions upon that subject. She got up to go before he could question her further. "I shall be late for luncheon," she said, "and Lady B. hates any of us to be absent." "I thought there was no such thing as punctuality at Medlow." "Oh, we are pretty punctual at luncheon. It's the hungry hour, and we are all ravenous. Good bye." "Au revoir. You will come to morrow, love, and come earlier, I hope." "Pas possible. I shall be out with the hounds." "Another blank day for me. But don't disappoint me in the evening, whatever the weather may be." She was gone, leaving him doubtful of her fidelity, though far from suspecting the extent of her falsehood. He endured the long, dull day as best he might, and improved his mind by skimming all the books which Lady Burdenshaw had sent him, which were really the cream of Mudie's last supply — travels, memoirs, gossip, magazines, books chosen with a view to the masculine mind, which was supposed to be indifferent to fiction. Evening came at last. His lamp was lighted, his fire swept and garnished. The hunting party would be jogging homeward in the wintry darkness, he thought. There were 3 hours to wait before 9:30, which was the earliest time at which he could expect his beloved. It was a little after the half hour when his heart began to beat faster at the sound of carriage wheels. This time she was not going to disappoint him. He listened for her step upon the stair, the firm, quick tread he knew so well; but it was another step which he heard, a slower and heavier tread, with much rustling of silken draperies. It must be Lady Burdenshaw come to chaperon her. It was Lady Burdenshaw, but alone. She came in and drew near his sofa with a serious countenance. "Great God!" he cried, starting up from his reclining position. "Is anything the matter? An accident in the hunting field. Is she hurt?" "No, my poor fellow, she's not hurt. It would take a great deal to hurt her. She's too hard. But she has done her best to hurt you." "What do you mean?" "She has gone off with that audacious scamp." "Major Swanwick?" "Yes. Did you suspect anything?" "I thought there was an understanding between them. They went off together early this morning, walked 5 miles to the station, leaving their luggage to be looked after by the Major's servant, who had received his instructions and who got everything packed and off by the 1 o'clock train for London. I got this telegram late in the afternoon from Salisbury." She handed him a telegram, which he read slowly, word by word, and then he slowly folded it and restored it to his visitor in heart stricken silence. The telegram was in these words: "To Lady Burdenshaw, Medlow Court. Major Stanwick and I were married at 2:00 before the Registrar. We start for Monte Carlo to night. Please break it to Harrington, and forgive me for going away without telling you. We thought it better to avoid fuss. Yours lovingly, Juliet Swanwick." "God help this infatuated girl," said Lady Burdenshaw. "She has married a scoundrel who is up to his eyebrows in debt. He behaved brutally to his first wife, and he is not very likely to treat this one any better. I'm very sorry I ever had them in my house together. He was an old flame, and he had lost her more than one good match by his equivocal attentions. As for you, my dear young fellow, I congratulate you upon a very lucky escape." Harrington put his hand before his eyes to hide the tears of mortification and wounded love. Yet, even while the sense of disappointment was keenest, he had a feeling that Lady Burdenshaw was right, and that he had escaped a lifelong martyrdom. How could he, with his limited means, have ever satisfied a woman who lived only for pleasure and excitement, dress and dissipation? Juliet had been very frank with him during their brief courtship, and he had seen enough of her character to know that this splendid creature was not of the stuff that makes a good wife for a professional man with his struggles all before him. He was sorry, he was angry, he was wounded to the quick; but in the midst of it all he felt that there was a burden lifted off his mind and off his life, that he could breathe more freely, that he was no longer overweighted in the race. Lady Burdenshaw stopped with him for an hour, and told him a good many small facts to his charmer's discredit, although he begged her more than once to desist. It was her only idea of comforting him, and it may be that her efforts were not misdirected. He was surprised on the following afternoon by a visit from his father, who was not satisfied with Lady Burdenshaw's report of his condition. Touched by this evidence of paternal affection, the young man took heart of grace and made a full confession, first of his engagement and the next of his pecuniary obligations, the acceptance so soon to fall due, the £20 borrowed from Hayfield. "I can pay that very easily out of my allowance," he said. "I only tell you about it to show what a mean hound I was becoming." "You were very hard driven, my poor boy. You had been unlucky enough to fall in love with an unprincipled woman. You may thank Providence for having escaped a life of misery. Such an alliance as that would have wrecked your future. I would rather you married a housemaid with a good character than such a woman as Juliet Baldwin. However, there are plenty of nice girls in your own sphere, thank God, and plenty of pretty girls with unblemished character and antecedents." Harrington went back to Dorchester with his father next day, and the acceptance was promptly honoured when it was presented at the house in Cornhill. Sir Henry had discounted it at the local bank almost immediately after it passed into his possession, and the bank had regarded the document as good value for their money, Matthew Dalbrook being very unlikely to allow his son's signature to be dishonoured. End of chapter 1. Volume 2, Chapter 2 of The Day Will Come by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. All the springtime of his love is already gone and past. Theodore went back to wintry London before the year was a week old. He settled himself by his lonely fireside in the silence of his old-fashioned rooms. All he had of the beauty of his world was a glimpse of the river athwart the heavy grey mists of a London morning, or the lamps on the Embankment shining like a string of jewels in the evening dusk. There were days of sullen, hopeless fog, when even these things were hidden from him, and when it was hard to work to keep that stealthy, penetrating greyness and damp cold out of his rooms. He had brought a fox terrier from Dorchester on his return from his holiday, an old favourite that had seen the best days of her youth, and was better able to put up with a sedentary life varied only by an occasional run than a younger animal would have been. This faithful friend, an animated little beast even at this mature stage of her existence, lightened the burden of his loneliness, were it only by leaping on to his knees 20 times in 5 minutes, and only desisting therefrom upon most serious remonstrance. It was pleasant to him to have something that loved him, even this irrepressible Miss Nipper, with her sidelong grin of affectionate greeting, and her unconquerable suspicion of rats behind the wainscot. He felt less like Dr. Faustus on that famous Easter morning when the emptiness of life and learning came home to the lonely student with such desolating intensity, when even a devil was welcome who could offer escape from that dull burden of existence. He had come back from his brief holiday dejected and disheartened. It seemed to him that she who was his lodestar was more remote from him than she had ever been, more and more remote, vanishing into a distant world where it was vain for him to follow. He had failed in the task that she had imposed upon him. He was no nearer the solution of that dark mystery which troubled her life than he had been when he first promised to help her. How poor and impotent a creature he must appear in her eyes! His only discoveries had been negative. All that his keen, trained intellect, sharpened by 7 years of legal experience, had been able to do, was to prove the unsoundness of her own theory. He had started no theory upon his part. No flash of genius had illumined the obscurity which surrounded Godfrey Carmichael's death. He went on with his plodding work, resolutely bent upon doing the utmost that patient labor can do to ensure success. Even if it were all vain and futile, that hope of winning favor in her eyes, the mere possibility of standing better with her, of showing her that he was of the stuff which goes to the making of distinguished men, even this was worth working for. She may have great offers by and by, he told himself, recalling what Lord Cheriton had said about his daughter's chances. With her beauty and her expectations, to say nothing of her present means, she is sure of distinguished admirers. But at the worst she cannot look down upon a man who is on the road to success in her father's profession. This ever-present consideration, joined to his love of his calling, sweetened all that was dry and dull in the initial stages of a barrister's career. While other men of his age were spending their evenings at the Gaiety Theatre, seeing the same burlesque and laughing at the same jokes night after night, as appetite grew with what it fed on, Theodore was content to sit in chambers and read law. It was not that he was wanting an appreciation of the drama. There was no man in London better able to enjoy the dignity of Hamlet at the Lyceum, or the rollicking fun of the Gaiety Bluebeard. He was no pedantic piece of clay, proud of the dulness that calls itself virtue. He was only an earnest worker, bent upon a given result, and able to put aside every hindrance upon the road that he was travelling. "They that run in a race run all, but one obtaineth the prize," he said to himself, recalling a sentence in an epistle that he had learned years ago at his mother's knee, words that always brought back the cold brightness of early spring, and a period of extra church services, long sermons in the lamp-lit church, and the voices of strange preachers, a time of daffodils and fish dinners, and much talk of high and low church. He had never faltered in his religious convictions. Yet in the days of his youth, that Lenten season in a country town, that recurrent sound of church bells in the chilly March twilight, had weighed heavy upon his soul. Almost the only recreation which he allowed himself in this winter season was an occasional attendance at Miss Newton's tea parties. He had secured acceptance for himself at these entertainments on the strength of his reading, and he was now established as a Shakespearean reader. Miss Newton having taken it into her head that Shakespeare is of all great poets the easiest understood by the people, and having ordered him to read Shakespeare until she should tell him to desist. "I know what they like and what they dislike," she said. "They'll not conceal their feelings from me when we talk you over after you've gone. As soon as ever I find them getting tired, I'll let you know." He began with Macbeth, a story which caught them at the very first page. The witches took their breath away; and when he came to the murder scene they were all sitting round him with their hair seemingly on end. He closed his first reading with that awful knocking at the gate, that one supreme stage effect which has never yet been paralleled by mortal dramatist. There were some of the girls who tumbled off their chairs and grovelled on the floor in their excitement. There were others who wanted to know the fate of Macbeth and his wife on the instant. "I do hope they were both hung, like the Mannings," said a meek widow. "Oh, but he wasn't so much to blame, Mrs. Kirby. That wicked woman drove him to it." "So did Mrs. Manning," argued a Bermondsey lady, "but they hung Manning all the same when they caught him. I was a child when it happened, but I remember hearing about them. He was took in Jersey, and she wore a black satin gown." "Oh, don't talk about your Mannings, Mrs. Hodge," cried one of the girls indignantly. "They were low, vulgar people.
These were a king and queen in a palace. It's all different. It lifts one up out of one's own life only to hear about them. You may read about murders in the newspapers till your eyes begin to swim, but you don't feel like that. I don't know when I felt so sorry for anybody as I feel for King Macbeth."
Marian sat silent, and refrained from all part in the chorus of criticism, but she moved to the piano presently, and began to play a Scotch air — a grand old march — slow, solemn music that was almost too much for the nerves of the more excitable among Miss Newton's party. She glided from one melody to another, and she played those wild Scottish airs with such thrilling power that they seemed to sustain and intensify the uncanny effect of the tragic reading. Theodore went over to the piano and stood beside her as she played. "I knew you were a musician," he said, "though I never heard you touch the keys till to night."
"How did you know?"
"My cousin Juanita told me. She remembered your playing in her mother's room when she was a child." The woman called Marian lifted her eyes to him with a look of patient reproach, as if she said, "You are cruel to hit any one so helpless as I am," and then, playing all the time, she answered coldly, "I do not know what you are talking about." "Don't you? Oh, but indeed I think you do, and I should be very glad to be of use to you if you would let me, for the sake of those old days. I don't think it is possible I can be mistaken, though you may have your own reason for refusing to confide in me." He was certain now in his own mind that this was Mercy Porter, and no other. That fine touch upon the piano implied sustained and careful cultivation. She did not play like a girl who had learnt music as an afterthought. He left the house when she did, and walked part of the way to the Hercules Buildings with her, but did not offer to go out of his way to see her home, being very sure she would refuse. "I wish you would trust me," he said gently, as they walked side by side, without looking at each other. "Believe me that every one at Cheriton is sorry for you. If you were to go back to the neighborhood you would have every one's sympathy. There would be no one to cast a stone."
"I am very sorry I ever mentioned Cheriton to you, Mr. Dalbrook," she said impatiently. "It was a foolish impulse that made me talk. You insist upon making guesses. You try to force a confession from me. It is hardly generous."
"My interest in you must be my excuse."
"You can do me no good by that kind of interest. I shall never see Dorsetshire again, so what can it matter who I was when I lived in that part of the world? There are hundreds of women in London as lonely as I am — hundreds, perhaps thousands, who have broken every link with their past. My life suits me well enough, and I am contented. I shall never try to change it."
"That is a pity. You are young enough to make a good wife to an honest man, to help in creating a happy home."
"Am I? I feel a century old, and I have done with every thought of love or marriage. When I woke to consciousness after that dreadful fever, awoke from darkness and oblivion like that of the grave, I entered upon a new life. I came out of that sickness like one who had passed through hell. Passion and hope and youth and good looks have been burnt out of me in a fiery furnace. It was a wonder to myself that my body was alive. It was no wonder to me that my heart was dead. From that time I have lived very much as I am living now, after a brief time of struggle and starvation, and the life suits me fairly well. I shall never seek to better it."
"That is hard, Marian." He called her by her Christian name, frankly, in almost paternal friendliness, not knowing any other name by which to call her. He was with Miss Newton earlier than usual on the occasion of her next tea drinking, so early as to be before anybody else, and he talked to his hostess about Marian — Marian Gray, Miss Newton called her — confiding to her his conviction that this young woman was no other than Mrs. Porter's missing daughter. He told her of his interview with Mrs. Porter, and of the mother's angry repudiation of her child. "I can but think that her hardness was assumed," he said, "and that the ice would melt at a touch if the mother and daughter could be brought together. I should like to try the experiment."
"It is hardly wise to try experiments with human hearts," said Miss Newton. "Marian is contented and at peace, if not happy. To force her back upon a mother who might be hard and bitter to her — do you think that would be true kindness?
What if the mother's heart has been yearning for her lost lamb in all these years, and by bringing her back I might make two lives happy?"
"Let the mother come to the child. Let her who has something to forgive be the one to make the advance. It is so hard for the sinner to go back. She must be helped back. If the mother were a woman with a motherly heart, she would have been searching for her lost child in all those years instead of wrapping herself up in her sorrow at home."
I own I have thought of that."
"Of course you have. You can't think otherwise as a sensible man. I have no patience with such a mother. As for Marian, I think she may get on very well as she is. I am fond of her, and I believe she is fond of me. She earns from 12 to 14 shillings a week. She pays 5 shillings for her room, and she lives upon 8 pence a day. I needn't tell you that the teapot is her piece de resistance. Her most substantial meal on some days consists of a couple of scones from the Scotch baker's, or a penny loaf and a hard-boiled egg, but when I go to see her she gives me an admirable cup of tea, and positively delicious bread and butter. Her room is the very pink and pattern of neatness. All the instincts of a lady show themselves in that poor little 2-pair back. She has curtained the iron bedstead and the window with white dimity, which is always clean and fresh, for she washes and irons it with her own hands. She generally contrives to have a bunch of flowers upon her work table, and hard as she works, her room is always free from litter. She has about half a dozen books of her own upon the mantel-shelf, her Bible, Milton, Shakespeare, Charles Lamb's Essays, Goldsmith's Poems, and the Ideals of the King, well-worn volumes which have been her companions for years. She borrows other books from the free library, and her mind is always being cultivated. I really believe she is happy. She is one of those rare individuals who can afford to live alone. Do not disturb her lightly."
"You are right, perhaps. The mother struck me as by no means a pleasant character, always supposing that Mrs. Porter is her mother, of which I myself have very little doubt." Theodore made no further effort to bring mother and daughter together, but he met Marian from time to time at Miss Newton's tea parties, and acquaintance ripened into friendship. Her refinement and her musical talent sustained his interest in her. He talked to her of books sometimes when they happened to be sitting side by side at the tea table, and he was surprised at the extent of her reading. She confessed when he questioned her that she was in the habit of stealing 2 or 3 hours from the night for her books. "I find that I can do with a few hours' sleep," she said, "if I lie down happy in my mind after being absorbed in a delightful book. My books are my life. They give me the whole universe for my world, though I have to live in one room and to follow a very monotonous calling." He admired the refinement of that purely intellectual nature, but he admired still more that admirable tact which regulated her intercourse with Miss Newton's homelier friends. Never by word or tone or half involuntary glance did Marian betray any consciousness of superiority to the uncultivated herd. She shared their interests, she sympathized with their vexations, she neither smiled nor shuddered at Cockney twang or missing aspirate. Winter brightened into spring, with all its varieties of good and evil, east winds rushing round street corners, and cutting into the pedestrian like a knife, west winds enfolding him like a balmy caress, and bringing the perfume of violets, the vivid yellow of daffodils into the wilderness of brick and stone; rainy days, grey, monotonous, dismal, hanging on the soul like a curtain of gloom and hopelessness. These made up the sum of Theodore's outer life. Within he had his books, his ambition, and his faithful love. He told himself that it was a hopeless love, but there are many things which a man tells himself and tries to believe, and yet does not believe. The very human longing for blessedness is too strong for human wisdom. Where there is love, there is always hope. He had grown accustomed to his life in chambers, and albeit he was much attached to his father, and was amiably tolerant of his brother and sisters, he could but feel that his solitary existence better suited his temper than residence in a family circle. At Dorchester it had been very difficult for him to be alone. Out of business hours his sisters considered that they had a claim upon him, a right to waste his life in the most trivial amusements and engagements. If he withdrew himself from their society and that of their numerous dearest friends, they accused him of grumpiness, and thought themselves ill treated. He had chafed against the waste of life, the utter futility of those engagements which prevented his keeping level with the intellectual growth of the age. He felt that his youth was slipping from under him, leaving him stationary when every pulse of his being beat impatiently for progress. And now it was pleasant to him to be his own master, free to make the best possible use of his days. He found a few friends in London whose society suited him, and only a few. Among these the man of whom he saw most was Cuthbert Ramsay, a young Scotchman, who had been his chief companion at Cambridge, who had studied medicine for 3 years in Leipsic and Paris with Ludwig and Pasteur, and who was now at St. Thomas. The two young men ran up against each other in that main artery of London life, the Strand, in the January twilight, and renewed the friendly intimacy of that bygone time when Ramsay had been at Trinity and Dalbrook at Trinity Hall. They dined together at a restaurant on the evening of that first meeting, and after dinner Theodore took his friend to his chambers, where the two sat late into the night talking over college reminiscences of hall and river. Cuthbert Ramsay had been one of the most remarkable undergraduates of those days, notable alike for mental and physical gifts which lifted him out of the ruck. He was 6 feet 2, with the form of an athlete and as handsome a face as was ever seen within the gates of Trinity, and these advantages of person, which would have been noteworthy in any man, were the more remarkable in him because of his utter indifference to them, or perhaps it may be said, complete unconsciousness of them. He knew that he was a big man, because his tailor told him as much; but he had never taken into consideration the question as to whether he was or was not a handsome man. Indeed, except when he had his hair cut, an operation which he always submitted to unwillingly and of dire necessity, it is doubtful if he ever looked into a glass long enough to know what manner of a man he was; certainly not at his morning toilette, when he moved restlessly about the room, hair brushes in hand, belabouring his handsome head, and exercising his extraordinary memory by the repetition of some scientific formula acquired during the previous night's reading. His own estimate of his appearance was comprised in the idea that he was very Scotch. That milky whiteness of complexion, touched with just enough ruddy colour to give life to the face, those brilliant blue eyes, the straight nose, clear-cut nostrils, firm lips and firmer chin, the high broad brow, and crisp auburn hair, constituted to his mind nothing more than his brevet of nationality. "No one could ever take me for anything but a Scotchman," he would say lightly, if any acquaintance ventured to hint at his good looks. "There's no mistake about me. Albion is written on my brow." From his childhood upwards he had only cared for large things, intent upon investigation and discovery from the time he could crawl, asking the most searching questions of mother and of nurse, prying into those abstract mysteries which perplex philosophers before he could speak plain. The thirst for knowledge had grown with his growth, and strengthened with his strength. His hardy boyhood had been spent for the most part in the windy streets of Aberdeen, marching with swinging stride along the granite pavement, his shabby red gown flapping in the north-easter; faring anyhow as indifferent to what he ate as he was to what he wore, ahead of his fellows in all things intellectual, and abreast with the best athletes of his year in the sports they valued; a king among men, and of such a happy disposition that nothing in life came amiss to him, and what would have been hardship to another seemed sport to him. Some one, a wealthy member of his extensive family, found out that this Cuthbert was no common youth, and that with a little encouragement he might do honour to the clan. This distant kinsman, one of the heads of the great house of Ramsay, sent him to Cambridge, where he entered as a scholar of his college, and at the end of a year gained a university scholarship, which made him independent. This hardy youth from the city of Bon Accord was able to live upon so little, could not for the life of him have been extravagant, having none of that mollesse, or soft self-indulgence, which is at the root of most men's squanderings. He was 29 years of age, and he had never worn a gardenia, and had only had one suit of dress clothes since he grew to a man's estate. Needless to say that albeit he went out very seldom, that suit was now somewhat shabby; but Cuthbert's superb appearance neutralized the shabbiness, and he looked the finest man in any assembly. His parents were in their graves before he left the university. He had no ties. He was free as Adam would have been if Eve had never been created. There was no one near or dear to him to feel proud of his honours, though his name was high in the list of wranglers, and he had taken a first class in science. And now, after that interval of serious scientific work in Leipzig and Paris, he was plodding at St. Thomas's with a view to a London degree, and thus the two hard-working young men, very intimate in the old days when Cuthbert's rooms in the Bishop's Hostel were conveniently adjacent to Theodore's ground floor in Trinity Hall, were thrown together again upon their life journey, and were honestly glad to renew the old friendship. Ramsay was delighted with his friend's chambers. "I was afraid there was nothing so good as this left in the Temple," he said, rapturously contemplating the blackened old wainscot and the low ceiling with its heavy cross beam. "I thought smartness and brand new stone had superseded all that was historical and interesting within the precincts of the Lamb. But these rooms of yours have the true smack. Why, I really believe now, Dalbrook, you must have rats behind that wainscot." "Perhaps I had, till Miss Nipper came to keep me company. answered Theodore, patting the terrier, whose neat little head and intelligent ears were lifted at the sound of her name. "And Nipper has made them emigrate to the next house, no doubt. I'm glad you like my rooms, Cuthbert. Like them? I envy you the ownership more than I can say. If anything can make me sorry that I am not a lawyer, it would be the fact that I can't live in the Temple. We doctors have no distinctive abode, nothing associated with the past." "Perhaps that is because medicine is essentially a progressive science." "Is it? Sometimes I begin to doubt if it has made any progress since Galen, or Albertus Magnus. I will admit that there was progress of some kind up to his time." "This house has an interest for me that it would have for no one else," said Theodore presently, while his friend filled his briarwood. "My kinsman, Lord Cheriton, occupied the rooms underneath these for about a dozen years, and it is a fancy of mine to keep his image before me as I sit here alone with my books. It reminds me of what a man can do in the profession which so many of my friends declare to be hopeless." "No one knows anything about it, Theodore. If you went into statistics you would find that the chances of success in the learned professions are pretty nearly equal. So many men will get on, and so many will fail, at every trade, in every calling. The faculty of success lies in the man himself. I always thought you were the kind of man to do well in whatever line you hit upon. A calm, clever brain, and a resolute will are the first factors in the sum of life. And so Lord Cheriton lived in this house, did he? I have heard people talk of him as a very distinguished man, as well as a very lucky one. By the by, it was in his house that strange murder occurred last year." "Yes, it was in his house, and it was his daughter's husband who was murdered." "Tell me the story, Theodore," said Ramsay, leaning back his handsome head and half closing his eyes, with the air of a man who liked hearing about murders. "I read the account in the papers at the time, but I've very nearly forgotten all about it." Theodore complied, and gave his friend the history of the case, and the failure of every attempt to find the murderer. "And there has been nothing discovered since last summer?" "Nothing." "That is rather hard upon Lord Cheriton, bearing in mind your detective's suggestion of a vendetta. The vendetta would not be likely to close with the death of Sir Godfrey Carmichael. Hatred would demand further victims — Lord Cheriton himself, perhaps, or this lovely young widow — but there could hardly be such a vindictive feeling without a strong cause. Enmity so deadly must have had a beginning in a profound sense of wrong." "I have studied the case from that point of view, but can discover no cause for such malignity. I have almost given up all hope of unravelling the mystery." "And your kinsman is to live under the sword of Damocles for the rest of his life? Upon my soul, I pity him. I can imagine nothing in Ireland worse than the murder of Sir Godfrey Carmichael, a man seated peacefully in his own drawing room, and a high principled, amiable young man, you tell me, who never was known to wrong his fellow man." Theodore Dalbrook did not spend his Easter holidays in Dorsetshire. He had heard from his sisters that Juanita was staying at Swanage with Lady Jane Carmichael. He was unwilling to intrude upon her there, and he had nothing to communicate upon the subject which was at present his only claim upon her interest. Under these circumstances he was easily persuaded to spend his vacation in a 10 days' trip to Holland with Cuthbert Ramsay, who was keenly interested in the result of some experiments which had been lately made at Leyden; and thus it happened that Theodore let some time go by without seeing any member of his family except his father, who came to London occasionally upon business, and whom his son was delighted to entertain and make much of in his chambers or at his club, the Serviceable Constitutional. Towards the end of April he read an announcement in the papers which had touched him almost to tears. On the 23rd instant at Millbrook Priory, the widow of Sir Godfrey Carmichael, of a posthumous son. He was thankful for her sake that this new interest had been given to her days; that a new and fair horizon was open to her in this young life, with all its possibilities of love and gladness. It might be that the coming of this child would change the current of her thoughts, that the stern desire for retribution would grow less keen, that the agonizing sense of loss would be softened almost to forgetfulness. He remembered those lovely lines of the poet philosophers: "A child, more than all other gifts, brings hope with it, and forward-looking thoughts." This child, he hoped, freighted with healing and comfort, came like the glad springtime itself, like Adonis or Persephone, with his arms full of flowers. He wrote to his cousin in tenderest congratulation, a letter breathing a generous affection, without one selfish thought lurking between the lines. Her answer came after nearly a month's delay, but although tardy, it was most delightful to him. Juanita asked him to be godfather to her boy, and he could easily imagine that this was the highest honour she could offer him. "In London, half the young men I used to meet took a pride in avowing their unbelief," she wrote, "but I know that you are not ashamed to acknowledge your faith in Christ and His Church. I shall feel secure that what you promise for my child will be fulfilled, so far as it is in your power to bring about its fulfilment. I know that if you stand beside the font and take those vows in His name, you will not remember that ceremony as an empty form, a mere concession to usage and respectability. Those promises will appeal to you for my fatherless child in the days to come. They will make you his friend and protector." He accepted the trust with greater gladness than he had felt about anything that had happened to him for a long time; and on a balmy morning in the last week of May, he found himself standing by the font of the old Saxon church at Millbrook, where he had heard the solemn words of the burial service read above Sir Godfrey Carmichael's coffin less than a year before. He took upon himself the custody of the infant's conscience in all good faith, and he felt that this trust which his cousin had given to him made a new link between them. The Grenvilles had come down from town to be present at the ceremony, though neither husband nor wife was officially concerned in it. Mrs. Grenville had seized the opportunity to bring Johnny and Godolphin to Dorsetshire for change of air. She had an idea that the Purbeck air had a particularly revivifying effect upon them, like unto no other air. "I suppose that is because it is my native air," she exclaimed. Mr. Grenville submitted to his nephew's existence as a mysterious dispensation of Providence, which it became him to endure with gentlemanlike fortitude, but he did not cease to regard a posthumous infant as a solecism in nature and society. "Your sister-in-law actually seems pleased with her baby," he told his wife grumblingly as he put on a frock coat in honour of the approaching ceremony. "But it appears to me that a woman of refined feeling would be impressed with a sense of incongruity, of indelicacy even, in the idea of a child born such ages after the father's death, a sort of no man's baby. And upon my word it is uncommonly hard upon Thomas. With such a family as ours, 5 and the possibilities of the future, it would have been a grand thing to have one well provided for. As things stand now they must all be paupers." Lord Cheriton was Theodore's fellow sponsor, and Lady Jane was godmother, an office which filled the dear soul with rapture. She held her grandchild throughout the service, except when she delivered him gingerly to the priest, who at one stage of the ceremony carried the new made Christian half way up the aisle, and, as it were, flaunted him in the face of the scanty congregation. Juanita stood like a statue while these rites were being celebrated, and in her pale set face there was none of the tender interest which a mother might be expected to show upon such an occasion. There was a deep pathos in that marble face and those black garments in an hour which has generally something of a festal aspect. Strangers thought her cold, a proud, hard young woman, thinking more of her own importance perhaps than of her baby. Yet could they have read beneath the surface they would have pitied the girl widow in her desolation on this day which should have been blessed to her. She could but think of him who was not there, of the father who had been fated never to look upon his son's face, of the son who was to grow from infancy to manhood without the knowledge of a father's love. Theodore watched that pale and lovely face, full of sympathy, but not without wonder. How would this new tie affect her? Would it soften all that was hard and vindictive in her mind? Would it be strong enough to bring about resignation to the will of Heaven, a patient waiting upon Providence, instead of that feverish eagerness to exact a life for a life? They two were alone together for only a few minutes after luncheon, strolling along the broad gravel walk in front of the dining room windows in the afternoon sunshine, while Lord Cheriton and Mr. Grenville lingered over coffee and cigars, and Lady Jane and her daughter made a domestic group with children and nurses under a gigantic Japanese umbrella. Short as that tete-a-tete was, it convinced Theodore that the child had not brought oblivion of the father's fate. "You have heard nothing more — made no new discovery, I suppose?" Juanita said nervously. "Nothing. Indeed, Juanita, I fear I have no talent as an amateur detective. I am not likely to succeed where Mr. Churton failed. It was easy enough for me to complete the record of the Strangways, to set your suspicions at rest with regard to them. That was plain sailing. But it seems to me I shall never go any further." "I'm afraid you will not," she said wearily, "and yet I had such hope in your cleverness
your determination to help me. As a lawyer you would know how to set about it. The London detective has many cases, his mind travels from one to another. He has no leisure to think deeply about anything, but you, who have had so much leisure of late, you would, I know, be glad to help me." "Glad? Good God, Juanita, you must know that I would cut off my hand to give you ease or comfort, respite even from a passing trouble. If you are really set upon this thing, if your peace is really dependent upon the discovery of your husband's murderer " "It is, Theodore. I cannot know rest or comfort while his death remains unpunished. I cannot lie down in peace at night while I know that the wretch who killed him is walking about, rejoicing in his wickedness, glad to have destroyed that blameless life, laughing at our feeble love which can let our dead go unavenged." "If cudgelling these poor brains of mine could bring me any nearer to the truth, Juanita," Theodore said, with a troubled sigh, "I should have helped you better. But so far I can see no ray of light in the thick darkness. I do not think any efforts of ours will solve the mystery. Only some accident, some inconceivable imprudence on the part of the murderer can put us on his track." And then he thought with horror of Ramsay's idea that a hatred so malignant as that which had killed Godfrey Carmichael might reveal itself in some new crime. He thought of the young mother bending over her infant's cradle in some unguarded room, calm in the fancied safety of her English home. He thought of her wandering alone in park or wood, while that rabid hatred lurked in the shadow, waiting and watching for the moment of attack. The horror of the idea chilled him to the heart, but he was careful not to hint at that horror to Juanita. He seized the first opportunity of being alone with Lady Jane, and imparted his fears, founded upon that suggestion of Cuthbert Ramsay's, to her. The kind creature was quick to take alarm, and promised to see that Juanita was guarded at all hours by all precautions that could be taken without alarming her. "She is surrounded with old and faithful servants," said Lady Jane. "A hint to them will put them on their guard. But if you thought it wiser, I would take her away from this place, take her away from England, if necessary. It is horrible to think of living at the mercy of an unknown foe." "My friend's notion may be groundless. The crime of last year may have been an isolated act, the inspiration of madness. In our efforts to account for the unaccountable, we may invent theories which torture us, and which may yet have no ground in fact. Only it is as well to think of possibilities, however hideous." He spent one night at the Priory, and before departure next morning, presented his offering of a fine George II. Mug to his godson, Godfrey James Dalbrook, who in his present stage of existence seemed to his godfather a scarcely distinguishable morsel of humanity smothered in over much cambric and Valenciennes. "I'm afraid if I were to meet my godson in the arms of a strange nurse I should not know him," he said deprecatingly, after he had kissed the rosebud mouth. "But please God the time will come when he and I will be firm friends. As soon as he is old enough to decline mensa, I shall feel that we can converse upon a common footing, and when he goes to Eton I shall renew my youth every time I run down to waste an hour in the playing fields watching him at cricket, or to drive him to the White Hart." Although he put on an air of cheerfulness in his leave taking, he left the Priory with a sense of deepest anxiety; and it was almost a relief to him when he received a letter from Lady Jane a week afterwards. "I could not get over the uneasy feeling which your suggestion awakened," she wrote, "so I am going to carry off mother and child to Switzerland the day after to morrow. Interlaken and Grindelwald are delightful at this season. We shall return to Dorsetshire as soon as the tourists begin to invade our retreat, and I trust in God that some discovery may be made in the meantime, so that all our minds may be more at ease." End of Chapter 2.